It is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Sabine Braun. When it comes to the broad topic of distance interpreting, which includes video remote interpreting and remote simultaneous interpreting, there is probably no better person to talk about this topic than Professor Sabine Braun. Professor Braun is Professor of Translation Studies and Director of the Center for Translation Studies at the University of Surrey in the UK. She is also co-director of the Surrey Institute for People-Centered Artificial Intelligence. What a nice name, and it is so great to know that this institute would have a translation scholar on board. In the past few years, Professor Braun and her center has essentially become a powerhouse for research on distance interpreting. Not only has she led several multinational research projects on video remote interpreting and interpreting in virtual reality environments, she and her research associates and PhD students have also conducted many excited studies on the wide range of RSI and VRI related topics. And some of the research we will be able to hear at this particular conference. And you will all have probably read this in the program handbook, but I find it too good not to read it out. Professor Braun's research explores the integration and interaction of human and machine in translation, in language translation and interpreting. For example, to improve access to critical information, media content, and vital public services, such as healthcare and justice for linguistic minority populations and other groups and people in need of communication support. Her overarching interest lies in the notion of fairness, trust, transparency, and quality in relation to technology use in this context. Today, Professor Braun will give us a grand overview of research on distance interpreting, and her topic is research on distance interpreting, past, present, and future. Professor Sabine Braun.
I'm nearly speechless. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for all the kind words, for such an introduction. I have now to try to live up to this. And also thank you very much for the invitation a long time ago, and apologies for not being there and for doing it at a distance. I think this is sad sign of our times, but I'm nevertheless very happy to be there and to see some of you, be you in the room or online, some friends, nice to see you. So I'll try my best. It's 6 o'clock in the morning here, and the earliest keynote I've ever given, I think. But that's a small price to pay for talking about one of my favorite topics, research on distance interpreting. Yes. It has certainly become some kind of truism by now to say that the pandemic has caused quite a shift towards virtualization globally, including the world of professional interpreting. And at the peak of the pandemic, as part of the whole global move towards remote working, a large proportion of interpreting assignments was delivered online, as we all know here, accelerating the evolution of distance interpreting that had, of course, started much earlier. But it has accelerated it from what was for a long time a relatively marginal practice, even though it was a hotly debated practice of mostly interpreting offsite for some individual clients or at selected events. And that has now, of course, expanded into interpreting fully virtually for an enormous variety of different types of events. At the same time, we are seeing a new trend. It was also discussed at the workshop yesterday. The new normal is the hybrid pattern of working and meeting, which has created, I think, yet a new phase in the delivery of remote interpreting services. and I will try and cover all of that. But again, none of this is in fact entirely new, and that's also my starting point here for today, to quickly have a look back at the beginnings, just not really of remote interpreting, but of the complex interplay between interpreting and technology, which I'm sure, as many of you are aware, here started just over 100 years ago, when supranational institutions became more established, and when they in fact moved more from bilingual to multilingual operation mode. At the time, where new solutions were needed to deliver interpreting services, and unsurprisingly, perhaps, although maybe surprisingly for the period of time, people looked to emerging technologies to create these solutions. At the time, consecutive interpreting was all the rage, and a distinction was made between the consecutive interpreter normally on the stage and then those who began to deliver additional translation services from the sidelines using the type of equipment that ultimately later on developed into simultaneous interpreting equipment. Although from the records that we have, it appeared that sometimes these, that's why I said translations were actually initially read out from prepared texts rather than delivered live and simultaneously.
Sabine?
Yes?
Whether you have started sharing your slides, or you're still giving your introduction.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. I just saw that message popping up. I thought my slides were still shared. Sorry. That's absolutely my bad. I will share them straight away. Okay, can you see them?
Yes. Yes, we can.
I'm so sorry about that. Okay, I get it now. They were unshared earlier, of course. So here we are. Yes, and here we are. So let's roll back. Here I was about 100 years ago. Can you see it all?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Sorry. Yes, so that was the time when what later became simultaneous interpreting was in principle delivered from the sidelines using devices that you can sort of see there on the left-hand side. And these interpreters were called telephonic interpreters, even though what they did was not telephone interpreting as we know it today. But there are some similarities, of course, namely in the use of the space, so removing the interpreter from the stage, literally from the stage, and which is, of course, still the case when we think about simultaneous interpreting today. Despite this, simultaneous interpreting that has emerged out of this remains, of course, a much more proximal modality of interpreting than those modalities that we would now consider as telephone interpreting or video interpreting or distance interpreting, and the modalities that I will be speaking about here. So simultaneous interpreting, that is very well known, established itself in the subsequent decades, but it took some more time for actual distance interpreting to emerge from this. Again, we have some earlier records where these ideas were mentioned in the 1950s. There's a German interpreter, Fredo Nestler, who wrote about this in the journal that some of you may know, the Lebende Sprachen journal, outlining a big real telephone interpreting service at the time for the German mail. I believe that never happened, but the idea was to include a simultaneous interpreter in international telephone calls. So I would like to point out the idea was not to do what we nowadays call remote interpreting with people on site and the interpreter off site, but it was actually meant to be already a three-way connection, including an interpreter. Another, I think, well-known interpreter at the time, Eva Panet, self-trained conference interpreter, practice searcher, well-known to her master's dissertation, I think, commented on that at the time, saying that this would be a very neat and obvious use of interpreters that would be introduced in the near future, and that it could also be developed further so that there would be no more necessity to displace interpreters for short conferences for a few hours. So that was in 1957. Okay. Nevertheless, it took, in fact, another 20 or so years for first experimentation with such services. They happened, and that's what you can see here on the right-hand side. One of the first experiments of this, not the very first one of the first experiments with the type of distance interpreting that that we sort of know today was in fact at the UNESCO to make use of a new satellite, the Symphony satellite, which was looking for applications. So that was a bit of it was and wasn't a case of technology looks for applications, but of course it was driven out of a need and of a demand to indeed do what Eva Panet had foreshadowed, namely to find ways of not needing to move large interpreter teams into supranational institutions all around the world. So this satellite experiment, which happened in 1976, and I think there was another one in 1978, in fact, tried different modalities of distance interpreting, remote interpreting by phone, remote interpreting by video, but also integrating an interpreter into a virtual meeting. So already at that time in the 1970s, distance interpreting, they didn't use that word yet, but distance interpreting was just much more than one thing. And I also want to jump back sort of to the early 1970s, when in fact, I think the very first remote interpreting service was launched in Australia, and it was not in conference interpreting. No, it was a telephone interpreting service to support the immigration services, because at the time Australia saw relatively sort of large waves of immigration. So 1970s, we have the first actual service running, and we also have the first experiments with such services in the supranational institutions. Yes, just to be clear that in the decades after that, things were tested. There wasn't too much movement. I mean, of course, simultaneous interpreting established itself in those next sort of decades. But in terms of moving the distance interpreting services forward, that was a relatively slow process. I think it took off much more in the last 20 years. And then when also a time happened when interpreting, in fact, interpreting and technology use branched out a lot more, just to acknowledge that here as well. In the last 20 years, what we have seen is not only the growth of distance interpreting, but we've also seen the growth of sort of augmenting interpreting performance, be it the preparation or be it real-time support to ASR. We will hear much more about that at the conference. We've also seen this whole idea of technology use in interpreting branching out into hybrid modalities, semi-automation to re-speaking, combining that with machine translation, if you like. And of course, we have also seen attempts at replacing interpreters. A lot of funding, a lot of research funding, an enormous amount of research funding has gone into that area with not a huge amount of success, I would say. Not my topic. We will today stick to distance interpreting and especially the research on distance interpreting. But nevertheless, before talking about the research, I think I would like to say a few things about the basics, about the terminology. Terminologically, this is still quite fluid. In the past, the term remote interpreting was used as a cover term, but the term distance interpreting that I've also chosen here has been introduced by the ISO, I think, in around 2017, and is used there alongside remote interpreting. But my suggestion has always been to actually distinguish the two and to use distance interpreting as a for any modality of interpreting that involves the use of communication technologies, be it to link an interpreter to clients and or also in situations where the clients or the primary participants are themselves distributed in a virtual space and the interpreter is integrated in that space. So sort of traditionally, I think I've, in my own mind, always made a distinction between whether this technology is used to or has as an effect the separation of the interpreter from the other participants, or whether the effect is that the interpreter is in fact integrated into something that is already a virtual meeting. So, that is indeed also, to my mind, one of the main sort of parameters that we can look at when we think about the different configurations of distance interpreting that we find, namely the location of the participants, including the interpreter. So, indeed, remote interpreting in the way that I use this word traditionally has involved that we have one client location, or I should maybe say participant location, primary participant location, sorry. And then we have one interpreter location. So the interpreter is offsite, but all the primary participants are in one place. And of course, you can also have, if you have multiple interpreters, they can all be in one location, or they can also be distributed. So I would call that scenario remote interpreting, still the scenario where all the primary participants are in one place. But then we have something that has come to be called, and I myself have used that term also quite a lot, teleconference interpreting. So this is in principle where the clients are in multiple locations. You could now think of that as a virtual event. And then we can have, again, very different distributions of the interpreter. The interpreter can be in one of these client locations. That is something that we have seen for quite some years happening. Or the interpreter can be in a separate location. That's also going back some time. This idea, as I've told you earlier, was around in the 1950s even. We ourselves tried that. I was one of the first, or the first video conference interpreting project I was working on in the very early 2000s. We tried a three-way video conferencing system where the interpreter was integrated in a video call that was supposed to help small businesses and small companies to have easier access to an interpreter. So that is when the interpreter is then not in any client location, then we clearly have a three-way, at least a three-way video link. Then, of course, we can again distinguish if you have only one interpreter or if we have multiple interpreters. Are these multiple interpreters all sharing the same location, or are they also themselves distributed? And you see that makes already quite complex, I would say, sort of package here of different configurations of distance interpreting, but I'm afraid it doesn't stop there. Of course, we also have, sorry, before I do that, I want to say that, of course, before the pandemic, the highlighted configurations, I think, were the most common ones. There was remote interpreting that was already quite well underway, but the interpreters would normally also then be in one place, in a hub, for example. And there was teleconference interpreting with, as I said, an interpreter normally co-located with at least some of the participants in one of the venues. This has changed post-pandemic, or when I use the term post-pandemic, I mean after the start of the pandemic. It's of course still there, and I think we are in a transition phase, and it's a bit uncertain. We don't really know where this goes with interpreting. As we said yesterday, it will become much more hybrid. So certainly it has, we are shifting to some kind of virtualization here, and that includes the hybridity. So now we see either fully virtual events, or we see events where people are distributed at multiple places, and where we believe one of these places to be sort of the main event, let's say a courtroom, where several participants are co-located, and then you also have several participants dialing in by audio, by video, and you have the interpreter somewhere in this mix. And I think this trend is in various forms very likely to continue. But yes, there is more to it. The participant locations are only one parameter. Of course, we have to also look at, I mean, it's still interpreting, it's embedded in all the other things, and the technology comes in here. What I have put on the left-hand side, parameters are all the technological basis from the type of platform that is used to the connection. So I come back to this slide in a second. So just very briefly to say, the technological basis has developed, and I would say it has developed very much in favor of interpreters for a long while. Certainly when we come from at the transition from ISDN-based to broadband internet-based interpreting in the 2000s, that was an important move that actually was much more conducive to interpreting in terms of sound quality, obviously. But then after that, we have also then seen more mobility in providing interpreting services with rollabout tablets in hospitals and with mobile phones, bringing again a lot less stability in terms of sound quality, for example. And of course, from the 2000s onwards, as we all, 2020s onwards, as you all know, we have seen an enormous amount of home working, which has come with all its own challenges, with more variation, variability, some headaches about the technology and so on and so forth. And we have gradually shifted from hardware or so-called on-premise systems, the old relatively clunky video conferencing systems, all the way through to the cloud-based systems, be they general video conferencing platforms like the one we are using today, or bespoke platforms, especially for remote simultaneous interpreting. There are also some other bespoke platforms in courts, for example, in the American courts, that allow court interpreters to combine simultaneous and consecutive mode to imitate what's normally going on in a traditional courtroom. So there are all different kinds of platforms. But just back to, so the technology is, of course, also just one of the sets of parameters that we have here. And I haven't commented on all of that, I'm aware of that. But one very important parameter then is the medium of communication. And then, of course, we also need to think about what setting are we actually talking about? Are we talking about conference interpreting, or are we talking about healthcare interpreting, and so on and so forth, which then comes with the different types of communication and, of course, the different modes of interpreting. So let's look a little bit at all that. How do we get all that in a two-dimensional slide? We don't, but you see my point here. I mean, we could easily recreate this diagram and say, let's look at what distance interpreting configurations are looking like by mode of interpreting. And so the cover term that I've always used for this is, if we use video, I've always talked about video mediated interpreting really as the cover term for all kinds of distance interpreting configurations that involve video, or we can then talk about telephone or audio mediated if they involve audio. And then we can again make this distinction between the remote variant and the teleconferencing variant, and so on and so forth. Somewhere there, I think, is remote simultaneous interpreting as a bit of a hybrid that involves sort of this asymmetry, that the interpreter is not necessarily seen, again, also to imitate the situation that we normally have in simultaneous conference interpreting. We have other interesting hybrid forms. We have what is called video relay services, because obviously video mediated interpreting is also very important in the world of sign language interpreting, and video relay service is the type of service that involves sort of a three-way, at least three-way connection, whereby a deaf person is connected to a call center by video, to an interpreter in such a call center, and the person who, the hearing person who would like to communicate with the deaf person is connected to that same interpreter, normally by telephone link. So this is a deliberately asymmetrical configuration in sign language interpreting. Otherwise, we of course also have video remote interpreting, and have had for quite a long while already. So yes, and then what we see more and more also is mixed media interpreting, where some people are connected via video link and other people are linked in by audio only. I believe we have also seen quite a lot of that during the pandemic, where people suddenly had to shift to the online mode, and where not everybody was always on video. Again, we have seen some of that in the public service interpreting world, where clients or court participants sometimes are only linked by audio. Also, some of the early remote simultaneous interpreting platforms were much more audio oriented, or that has changed very much so to video mode. So yes, ultimately, of course, I think it is difficult to discuss all of that without at least looking to some extent what happened in the different settings. In the different settings, we find a combination of these parameters that I have just tried to distinguish, and I would also say there isn't a full sort of type of systematicity, because all of this is always driven by the needs. So this brings me back to my earlier point. We have earlier talked about, or I've talked about the beginnings, the first experiments in conference interpreting that were driven by this need to find ways of not moving around large interpreting teams too much. So that led in the conference interpreting setting to quite a number of tests in the 1980s, 1990s. Not all of them were sort of fully documented in terms of research publications, but there are several reports out there. One of the very early tests came from the Heinrich Hertz Institute from Böcker and Andersen in 1993. They, in principle, used recorded videos to test out what it would be like to interpret in front of those, and to then imagine that you interpret in video link scenarios. But then the first study really testing the way of what we now know as remote simultaneous interpreting was, of course, the study by the ITU and the University of Geneva by Barbara Moser-Mercer, which took place in the very late 1990s and was then reported by Barbara in 2003 and 2005. There were other studies, for example, the study by the European Parliament, which was later reported in Rosiner and Schlesinger in 2010. So some of these studies were reported sort of as research reports a bit later, but much of this is also summarized by Takis Musarakis in 2006, pointing out that all of these different tests, which, by the way, ultimately focused on remote interpreting rather than teleconference interpreting, although some of the earlier tests had included both. But what Musarakis also pointed out is that these tests used quite a variety of technical conditions. Many of them didn't meet, in terms of sound quality, didn't meet the ISO standards that were already, of course, available for interpreting booths. There were lots of objections. There were complaints from interpreters. There were also in those studies many differences, subjective differences, and a discrepancy between sort of the subjective feedback that interpreters gave and some of the sort of objectively established parameters like quality, stress. I'll come back a little bit to that later. But in principle, what Takis Musarakis said at the time, it seemed that across this whole variety of conditions, the overarching issue seems to be the remoteness, the lack of the sense of social presence, the sense of togetherness that we have when we all meet in one and the same room. And the idea of remote interpreting, as it was called at the time, was also met with considerable resistance, yes, by professional interpreters, most visibly in the discourse of the AIC at the time, in the AIC guidelines from 2000 and the updated version in 2012, remote interpreting in the sense of how I have defined it was in fact deemed as unacceptable and as a use of technology that shouldn't happen. Of course, over time that has changed. In the 2000s, we've seen much sort of wrangling, many practical developments in the supranational institutions, despite continued skepticism and reticence by the interpreting profession. In 2005, I believe it was in 2005, was the sort of G20 in Hampton Court Palace. I've put one of these images here on the bottom left. That was perhaps the first big event where interpreters were confined to distance, not a long distance. It was a hub, or what is now we would call an interpreting hub in principle. The interpreters were just not allowed in the actual meeting room. And I think from this onwards, this whole idea that the interpreters can be removed from the meeting room took off, and the idea of interpreting hubs, I think, caught on. There were more and more complex sets. Klaus Siegler and Giglio Bianco talk about this in their 2018 publications to describe how much more complex the settings have become in terms of screen use. I don't think I have a photo of, yeah, you can see on the top left, you can see a little bit that interpreters were then confronted with an ever larger number of screens in front of their booth to hopefully see everything of the meeting from different perspectives. Generally, this idea of interpreting hubs, of course, caught on also in the commercial interpreting market, popularized by big events such as the World Cup in Brazil in 2015, which was also accompanied by a study that was reported by Kilian Seber and colleagues in 2019. Yes, this then also raised the question about other factors that may in fact tip the balance for an interpreter, whether they might in fact find this preferable. Some of this is, I think, foreshadowed in the study by Kilian Seber and colleagues. That study already painted a sort of much more positive picture, that the interpreters had more positive perceptions around the feasibility of that. I think it was also Kilian who raised the question about how much traveling is too much for an interpreter, and when the balance tips towards a preference for remote interpreting on the grounds of traveling. This is all before the pandemic, of course. All of these notions have undergone some change, but one of the major changes is, of course, that in the 2010s onwards, a parallel development to the hubs has emerged, and that is the development of the cloud-based virtual platforms that we all know today. Some of these were already tested before the pandemic. The SCIC published a report about some of them in 2019, concluding after some testing that it is in principle possible to interpret via these platforms. It is logically very difficult to say how that would have developed without the pandemic, whether the hubs would have taken off. What we know now is, of course, that there has been this shift from booth to virtual platform for the last 2 years. We also see, as I've said before, that it might move back a little bit more to hybrid. But clearly, the trends that we have seen here in the last years, starting before the pandemic, but accelerated by the pandemic, is that a largish number of these bespoke remote simultaneous interpreting platforms has emerged. New features were added very rapidly. Some of them converged, some of them changed. So this market is also, there's quite a lot of movement in this market. We have seen interpreters working on these platforms and using multiple other devices to make their new workstation more comfortable, or to access also other materials. So interpreters using multiple screens, additional laptops, tablets, and similar. It's become quite a complex workstation and environment. Some of the platform features that have been added over time have, of course, tried to mitigate the use for such a complex technical environment. So the integration of more interpreter support features has taken off now, from handover features to the booth-mate chat. And now, of course, we're also talking about integrating support to AI, to ASR. So these are all recent trends. Another recent trend was also briefly discussed yesterday in the workshop, that, of course, the generic platforms like the one we are using today have integrated some features of interpreting, but that's, of course, not the same as the real bespoke simultaneous interpreting platforms. However, we've also seen in a recent survey by Boujean and Collard that the bespoke simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms, that was a large survey among, I think, over 800 interpreters. These delivery platforms still, compared to generic platforms such as Zoom, have a relatively small market share. And then we have as another new idea, the idea of plugging in the platforms into any communication platform that is used in meetings or in conferences as something that is possibly making the idea of having your own, in your pocket, your own simultaneous interpreting platform, yet a much more flexible and mobile idea. Okay, so that's as a bit of background how the whole conference interpreting sort of setting evolved in terms of distance interpreting. To summarize that, so for a long time, I think the movement in conference interpreting was relatively slow, and for a long time, the developments in distance interpreting were in fact carried by the other settings in the public service sector. But I think in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've seen a lot of movement in RSI. In the world of business interpreting, which is always sometimes a little difficult to distinguish, and it's not much is known. I mentioned earlier in Germany, we had this Wikis project that was supposed to provide a solution for small and medium enterprises who want to have video calls. That was its idea in the 1990s, that they could have easier video calls thanks to the advent of ISDN at the time, and that you could link an interpreter into those video calls to make them three-way calls, and the interpreter could interpret simultaneously in these dialogue situations. We tested this at the time. This was, of course, very difficult because of the insufficient sound quality ultimately that ISDN was able to provide. Nevertheless, it was very interesting to see how the interpreters adapted or tried to develop strategies to cope with that situation. And that's something I will come back to when I talk a little bit more about research and interpreting. So in the legal setting, developments have been different to some extent, although, of course, to go back to my point about demand here as well, this was all driven by demand here, not so much by the demand in the first place to link an interpreter or an interpreter team and to avoid teams to move around a lot. But in fact, what happened in the justice sector in many countries was that from the 1990s onwards, if not a bit earlier, there was a growing use of video conferencing technology to link court participants to the court. So, for example, to link witnesses who couldn't travel to the court to make their lives more comfortable, in fact, or also to link defendants in custody in pre-trial prisons to a court to avoid having to transport prisoners from prisons to the courtroom. That idea caught on there was a lot of that, for example, in the UK already in the 1990s. There were early tests with that, and some of these early tests also included interpreters, although that not much about that was reported, which is perhaps symptomatic for the attention that is paid to court interpreters in the UK, or rather the lack thereof. So that meant that in the UK and many other European countries that we have researched, for example, also in our Avidicus project, what you see here on the bottom left is that led to this teleconference interpreting by video links, or what I would call video conference interpreting, where you see that some of the participants are in the main courtroom, and then a defendant or a witness is somewhere else and can be accompanied. Of course, if it's a defendant, they will be accompanied by their lawyer, who would normally be set next to them. And that also raises immediately this question: where is the interpreter? Is the interpreter in the courtroom, or is the interpreter co-located with the other language speaker? I will come back to that. We've done a study on this to find out about these preferences. In the United States and elsewhere, I think, but mainly we know it from the United States. On the top left, the other type of interpreting via video also developed, and that's the remote video interpreting. So in some of the states in the US, in Florida, for example, there were already in the 1970s onwards, there was the idea, and then there were the systems to interpret remotely. So the interpreter was offsite, usually in the same court building, but in their own office. And they were able to use a system that allows them to combine, to switch between simultaneous and consecutive interpreting. So to imitate the situation that you would do simultaneous, or you would whisper in part of the court hearings and you would switch to consecutive. So those systems have also now been implemented, and even long before the pandemic, they were implemented in several other states, in California, for example, as well, surrounded by similarly intense discussions between the, in this case, between the court services and the interpreters, similar to the discussions that we saw in the conference interpreting world between the professional interpreter associations and the supranational institutions, for example. So similar concerns around the challenges of delivering that kind of interpreting service. In the US, we have also seen remote interpreting by telephone as a service between federal courts to help out with, to assist with rare languages. And that system, as far as I know, is still in place, that that if you need an interpreter for a language that isn't common in that particular state, they would seek the assistance from other court-certified interpreters, and they would be linked in by telephone. But then, of course, what we have seen more recently in many countries is the move towards even fully virtual hearings by video or by audio, or mixed video and audio. So that's another recent development, and we have yet to see how long that is going to last, and whether that's becoming the norm for courtrooms. I don't think so, but in the UK, for example, we see that many family hearings are still very much online, whereas some of the criminal hearings have gone back hybrid, and I think there will be different similar developments elsewhere. So I think I need to speed up a bit. Healthcare settings, and the situation there is again a little bit different. I believe the remote variant is the one that was mostly needed in healthcare and mostly practiced in healthcare for quite a long time. First on telephone links, and in about, yeah, that's sometimes difficult to say when this happened, but I think about 10 years ago, no, earlier, sorry, about 20 years ago, we see the first studies on using video, and we also see studies, especially studies that come from the healthcare services rather than studies that are carried out from interpreting scholars, that are comparing video, telephone, and on-site interpreting in healthcare settings, with the aim of finding out about the effectiveness of these three modalities, and of course, ultimately with the aim of finding out whether remote video or telephone interpreting is good enough, so to speak, or whether to use that as a replacement for an on-site interpreter. And we can talk a little bit about these studies later. Not all of them always had sort of the interpreter in sight, and not all of them, or very few of them, in fact, have focused on interpreting quality in the sense of how we as interpreting scholars would actually investigate that. There were other priorities. Now, of course, during the pandemic, we have seen a shift also here towards, in this case, the other variant, namely fully virtual, so video links between healthcare provider and patient, and the interpreter linked in there, either by video or by audio, or very mixed. Also using mobile phones, using additional devices. Some interpreters using 2 telephones to link to the doctor and to the patient. So we see a whole lot of mixes there that are not very well documented yet. We will hear some of that from Angela Zhang later today, I think, who has studied this very recent situation in the healthcare setting. Okay, generally we see this this shift towards, as I said before, this shift towards virtualization, accelerated by the pandemic. Although I think this was on the cards in all of these areas beforehand, which means we have ended up with a with a large variety of settings, of, if you like, configurations, if you like, prototypical configurations. Those are the ones that I've tried to outline. But I think you have also seen, hopefully, from this overview that apart from these prototypical ones that we can nicely put in a taxonomy, there is a lot happening that is sort of somewhere in between those things, which makes it, I think, even more challenging to research this. And so it's this question, sort of, where do we start? But okay, if we accept that this virtualization is that this shift has happened and that some of it is rather irreversible, that interpreting will stay online to some extent, likely also as an interplay between technological advances and evolving demand, and also maybe legislation such as human access, sort of language access rights. So in this mix between the evolution of technology, the evolution of demand, and the evolution of other factors in society, we then need to find a way of establishing this sort of optimal human-machine symbiosis, if you like. And I don't think we have really been able to tackle that yet in research. We have, of course, started, but when we do that, I think, first of all, in this whole process, we need to bear in mind that technology, even though it is sort of very tempting to look at it through this technological lens to see what other feature has been added here, and that's all very important in practice. But first of all, technology is of course a social rather than just a technical concept, if you like. And if you look in the world of technology studies, we have a variety of offerings there also to find suitable theoretical frameworks or conceptual frameworks that allow us to reflect on how this technology has been used and what is in store for it. So, for example, the reasons, if you look at the reasons for acceptance or rejection of any technological artifact, like telephone interpreting, video interpreting, distance interpreting, often these the reasons are rather found to be in the sort of social environment, the social world that surrounds them, and the conditions that come with it, than in the technology alone. That goes to go back to what I said earlier, for example, about the observation of Takis Musarakis, that none of these many sort of earlier tests were sort of to the liking of the interpreters. I think there we can very clearly see that this didn't just have technical reasons. It was also the way that interpreters were literally removed from their working environment, and that this was seen as something that was perhaps not properly explained. It was not properly discussed. We see the same in legal settings where such shifts happened. The London Metropolitan Police, for example, had the same. They started using hubs. There was not a huge amount of discussion among the interpreters and the institutions in such cases. So we have many other reasons than just technology. And on the other side, we also see where we use technology that is not necessarily made for interpreting, and that it can work if parties make an effort and if parties agree that that there is no other way, or if indeed there is no other way, as we have seen in the pandemic. Yes. If we see this against the background of the wider social setting where this is embedded, then we can then it's clear that the same technology means very different things to different people and at different times, I just said, and that sort of the success of a technology may in fact arise less so from how advanced that technology is from a technical point of view, then also looking at what the kind of social values that people are attaching to it. And that is something that we have seen in the pandemic. However, I need to put a caveat here. Of course, in order to provide interpreting services appropriately, we do need to talk about minimum standards for technology. I'm not trying to sideline that or wish that from the table. My point here is a bigger point to say that the technology is not the only parameter that plays a role here. Ultimately, also, I've put it here on the screen. It is clear that interpreting, distance interpreting is integrated in the context of interpreting, where we all know it's a cognitively, linguistically, pragmatically, socially, interactually, culturally, and so on, a very demanding job to do. And the technology here is in principle added as an additional dimension. All the other challenges that we have in interpreting, they don't go away in distance interpreting. They are still there. We add technology, we interact with technology, and through that technology, we then interact with the others. So that's this adds another layer of complexity in these increasingly virtual environments where being distributed has become the new sort of situated. You will remember we often talked about interpreting as a very situated practice. Now we are very distributed, and I think that is another form of situation that we have dealt with. Scholars who work in the realm of human-computer interaction, they have talked about fractured ecologies where people are in different environments, people have different perceptions, people build different mental models depending on where they are, which has an effect here. The virtualization has become the new normal. Yes, and as I said, we need to find that sort of optimal way of establishing how this human-machine symbiosis can happen. We can look in terms of research. I was just outlining this a little bit. Yes, at frameworks that I have borrowed here a minute ago of social construction of technology by Trevor Pinch and Wiebe Baecker, for example, that have shown us how technologies get to be accepted or not, that this is often a power struggle, and the sort of micro-political power strategies are often used by different social groups that are involved. We can see that very nicely when we especially look at things like legal interpreting and how distance interpreting has come into that, how justice sector institutions have pushed forward with the implementation of these technologies, where interpreters have obviously been much more cautious and much more skeptical about it in many ways. So where you have these different sort of social stakeholders and they try to push for different solutions, where you see the conflict happening and where there is no agreement yet, no so-called, as they call this in the Scott framework, no closure yet about how this technology is used. And I believe this is what is going on at the moment in all the different settings where distance interpreting is used, that we have no so-called closure. That is, we don't really know yet which way it's going. We know it's partly irreversible. It won't go back, but the actual pathway is still relatively open. Also, as I said, useful frameworks here to look at that are, of course, frameworks that have to some extent developed out of things like Scott, because Scott has been sort of fundamental in its response against all the sort of technological determinism, the idea that technology is always the solution. Scott has tried to be much more cautious and say we need to investigate to what extent this can actually happen. So out of this we have seen the development of fields like human-computer interaction that has broadly concerned really with how people design and implement and use artifacts of technology. We have seen the field of computer-supported cooperative work that has studied sort of the social interactions through technology in some more detail and at some more micro levels. And we can borrow some of that. I don't think there is a very sort of close match. Oh yeah, sorry. And the other concept I wanted to mention, there is of course also what comes out of these lines of research is this discussion around the so-called sense of presence that was already that Musarakis had already pointed out, that feeling of being there or that feeling of being together that we don't have when we do distance interpreting and other online activities. There is, we can certainly borrow from those. I don't think there is a sort of close mapping at the moment on in interpreting studies and distance interpreting approaches, not a close mapping to those frameworks, but they are there in the background. And so that brings me to some more examples of the sort of actual research that's gone on here. I've always tried to divide this up, and this is not new. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Try to also fill it as we have more research. what kind of research activities we actually see here. So on the one hand, people have researched the practices, how technology has been implemented and used, what drives this, what do the workflows look like. So I've outlined some of this earlier when I was talking about the different settings and what it looks like there. Some of this is well documented, other areas are not so well documented, so there we only have anecdotal evidence. Then, of course, there are the perceptions, and that certainly goes back to the frameworks that I've just outlined, that how users perceive the technology, how users work with it. So there are participant perceptions, including interpreter perceptions, preferences, attitudes. What's its effectiveness compared to on-site interpreting? What about this feeling of presence? So all of this we can put under sort of research in the realm of user experience and perceptions, perhaps. Then there is research on sort of the core of interpreting, the interpreting quality, the psychological and physiological factors around it as well, strategy choices. So that all has to do, again, with affordances of this technology, affordances and constraints, you can say. How do they impact the quality? How do they impact the other factors? So we've of course seen quite a lot of research around that already. And similarly, the interaction, how do the affordances and constraints of this distance interpreting technology impact on the interaction, on the participant distribution in relation to each other? I've talked about that earlier. The organization of the space, these structured ecologies. So how do people position themselves, for example, towards the screen, and those factors, and communicative interaction, of course, interaction and communication management, all of those things have also received more attention in research recently. Yes, we can also look at the wider impacts of the technology on things like role perceptions, working conditions, other professional aspects. But the other way around, we can also think around the impact of other factors on maybe the improvement or the mitigation of some of the challenges of distance interpreting. So what about the individual predisposition of interpreters? Our very own Diana Singuriano will speak later. So this is a bit of advert here, but Diana has just completed her study on the role that emotional intelligence could perhaps play in explaining individual preferences or dislikes and the varieties that of feelings that interpreters bring to distance interpreting. Yes, the impact of adaptation. What about this long exposure that interpreters have had to this now? The impact of training, of course, also the impact of system design. Also from Surrey, Ahmed's side is currently looking at interface design, the sort of visual aspects of this interface and what impact that could have on the user experience, or then the integration of supporting technologies into distance interpreting. Several of us here at the conference are looking at supporting technologies like ASR, including increasingly also thinking about how this can be integrated in platforms. Eloy Rodriguez and others, of course, have begun to look at that as an area for further research. So I want to give some examples of that research. By necessity, this will have to be it's not possible to go through each and every piece of research. I'm most comfortable talking about the research that we have done. This is not to sideline at all much of the other research that has been done, to exemplify the point about, yes, the practices and the perceptions and the experiences. I want to show you a study that we have done not so long before the pandemic, where we have investigated how those practices and then to some extent the experiences and the preferences look like in the area where I've done most of the video mediated interpreting research in legal settings. So in 2014-16 we had this quite substantial European project where we looked at, it was a follow-up from earlier projects where we looked at how video conferencing systems across European justice sector institutions are implemented, and in courts and other justice sector institutions, prisons, police custody suites, and so on and so forth, and how whether the way these systems are implemented there is actually conducive to the bilinguality or the multilinguality, and how they whether they are appropriate for that. And so this is often they have to be implemented in the sense of teleconference or video conference interpreting, so that individual participants are linked into the court. At the time, what was less prominent there was the sort of remote interpreting. Yes, so I won't go through all of this in detail, but the approach to this study was, I think it was nearly sort of an ethnographic approach. We went to the sites, to the courtrooms, to the prisons, to the police stations where we could get access. We interviewed over 100 people on site, and according to the theoretical frameworks that I've also just lined out, the social construction of technology, for example, we were really trying to talk to all the different stakeholder groups to see where they are with that technology in their mind, how they construe it, how they perceive it. And what we have tried to establish in those interviews, which we did on site, so we were able to see how people use this technology. We were able to get this explanation from them right there and right then, literally how they make the connection, how they sustain it, and so on and so forth. But we also talked to people who commissioned this equipment, who are responsible for implementing it. And so you can see it listed there. The themes that we looked at are very much from top down, how it's commissioned, to right at the bottom, the sort of micro sort of communication environment, how people find strategies to communicate in these video links. And what we found from this study is, just going through some of them, is really interesting differences in sort of the commissioning patterns. There were some countries I would call early adopter countries. I said this before. England, for example, had video links in courts since the 1990s, and some other countries as well. So there, this video equipment that was implemented not with interpreting in mind, but with linking courts and prisons and courts and police stations, things like that in mind. This was always focusing on localized, sort of very high pressure context. Some of it was implemented in immigration services. Some of it was implemented for first hearings in criminal courts. So very localized, punctuated. So great fragmentation, which was very visible also in the video conferencing equipment that was used across these justice sector institutions, where in London we found police stations, they had different kinds of video equipment for different purposes. And there's not only a waste of resources, but it also makes the whole thing very difficult to manage. And that, of course, has an impact on stakeholders. In a minute, I show you interpreter satisfaction levels across different European countries, where I believe we see some of that. And then we have late adopter countries like the Netherlands and Sweden. They adopted this in the noughties and used the same technology across each and every courtroom, making it very easy for people to handle it. And so generally much more positive feedback from such countries. But in general, despite all these equipment differences, by the way, the general point, unfortunately, was that there is, whether the equipment was new or old, very little evidence at the time for of planning for interpreting requirements and integrating interpreting. So, for example, in terms of the sound quality, and also very little planning for more complex cases, so for cases that might require multiple interpreters, or for cases with more than one remote participant. I must say, to me, it was already clear before the pandemic that distance interpreting would become more diverse. And I think this was quite easy to see at the time, that there would be more remoteness and more video links to more than one court participant, for example. Those things were already being discussed at the time. And so in light of that, it was quite interesting, to say the least, to see that there wasn't any planning for that. So there was, when there are multiple interpreters, then we can't do it remotely, and so on and so forth. So there was that tendency of expanding the video link use of diversifying it in the justice sector, but without sufficiently considering one of the important stakeholder groups, given all the multilingualism in Europe, namely the interpreters. So I'm not going to go to all of this, but another really interesting factor was this, I mentioned this before, that's why I want to say it here, is this whole discussion about the interpreter location. I'll go to the next slide. Where should the interpreter be when you have most participants in a court, and then you have the other language speaker, the witness or the defendant, in another room or in another building or elsewhere? So we asked the legal practitioners in our surveys and interviews, and we also asked the interpreters about that. And I will keep that short because we have also published that already. But interestingly, the opinion was divided, not between interpreters and legal practitioners, but the opinions were divided within each group. Each group had, I find, relatively reasonable. Some of them are less reasonable, as you can see here. Some legal practitioners felt that when the interpreter is not in court, they are not disturbing, and then they can be muted. So this is where I would draw the line with reason. But some arguments were more reasonable than that. For example, some legal practitioners felt that it would be better if the interpreter was together with the other language speaker rather than sitting in court, because then the interpreter could provide better emotional support. Of course, there is that question, is that the role of the interpreter? But at least you can see the line of argument from a legal practitioner here who has a reason that is at least worth considering, and it's perhaps a valid point. On the other hand, you have the others who say the interpreter should be in court. Also, again, one really useful argument here was the communication, that for the court participants, for the judge, for example, there might be a much better chance of detecting interpreting problems when the interpreter is in court. So you see how this argument can go either way. And similarly, it was around among the interpreters, these arguments and preferences were pretty much as divided as for the legal practitioners. The arguments were, of course, different, but some people felt when they are not in the courtroom, they get pretty much forgotten, because then they get no chance to interpret, because the court participants will not pause for them, whereas others felt if they are together with the other language speaker, they can provide better support, they can increase the rapport and so on and so forth, and they can do chuchotage, which of course is not possible when you are separated from the person who speaks the other language. That's also something that Diana Singoriano has looked at, and we'll talk about that later, how that has recently panned out in UK courts, where the video conferencing systems that are used do not allow the interpreter to interpret simultaneously as a proper replacement of chuchotage. In the sense, it's very chaotic there at the moment in those courts. Anyway, what comes out of this is, in fact, that neither location seems to be really ideal, and that that from a design point of view, I think many years ago already, it would have been useful to think about arranging this very differently, arranging a separate place for an interpreter. Again, that raises additional challenges. If the interpreter is all by themselves, it's again a different configuration, but that wasn't really on the cards. That has, of course, changed. But I also wanted to say, so this research was done before the pandemic, but I do think it's, despite these changes, there are still many valid points that we can take from it. So that sounds like a bit of self-praise. It's not intended like that. It's an example, and to say that there is there is a rich set of responses here from different kinds of stakeholders, and bearing in mind that we are now at a stage where we are going back from fully virtual in many cases to something that is much more hybrid, then we are actually going back to something that looks more like what we found in the study. In this study, we dealt with mostly one remote participant. Now we might deal with 2 or 3 remote participants in these situations, but it's going to swing that hybrid way. So I think we can certainly use that research and other types of that research to learn a lot also post-pandemic. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot more to say here around positioning, the compromises that had to be made for how the interpreter is positioned in court and where they are put because of camera constraints. So all of this says and cried out loudly to say there are design issues here with the system design that certainly need to be addressed. Yes, I wanted to show you this briefly as a sort of follow-up on this. We also did an earlier survey where we had asked, sorry, something has gone on, sorry, an earlier survey where we had asked interpreters, again, across different countries in Europe, about their overall satisfaction with video-mediated interpreting in legal settings. And the way our sample ultimately fell was that we had 59 valid answers for this one from England, not the UK, England, and then 36 from other countries. So the sample was, we had loads of responses from England, but in the sense here that what I've tried to do with this comparison was actually quite useful, because as I said earlier, England was an early adopter of these video conferencing systems in the legal setting, and whereas in the other countries, mostly it was established later. So you can see here very quickly that the responses show that the satisfaction rates in England were much lower. And I mean, I had to anticipate, or I had always thought that what I have just told you earlier about the early adoption and the problems that there are, that this could be quite sort of reasons for this. But the survey itself gave me another hint, and then also, yes, the interviews that we did with the interpreters certainly gave me a strong hint of why that is. So, for example, when we asked what options the interpreters in the survey who took part in so what they have in terms of operating the equipment, you can see here that in England, in the video conferencing systems at the time, there was much less opportunity of actually interacting with this equipment, of setting up the camera properly before, of adjusting the volume before. So there was much more opportunity in the other countries that had survey respondents, because largely speaking, their video conference systems were more modernized, they were more suitable for this purpose. And you can see how we have no way of knowing for sure that there is a relationship between these, but it's quite likely that there is a relationship here between how they feel about this equipment and their satisfaction rates, of course. And I believe we need to dig deeper in this kind of direction to see what actually do interpreters really find in this in the workspace that there are nowadays, and and how they interact with it, and how that impacts on all kinds of factors, on their experience, on the quality, and so on and so forth. So then moving on a little bit here, yes, we also did sort of a follow-up study, and we are still doing this to see how the court environment that interpreters find looks now. It's very much work in progress. I will probably talk about that again somewhere. We did sort of a recent survey where we asked again legal interpreters and then all the other legal stakeholders that we were allowed to ask, only in England though this time, and we wanted to see what type of configurations they are working with now, and of course a lot of other questions. I'll just give you a glimpse really, and say that so in what we could see that 84% of our sample said they work in hybrid configurations, so where some people are in courtroom and some on video links, and at the time 80% said they also work fully virtual by video, so that is certainly new. Interestingly, interpreters report on the whole, to summarize this here a little bit, there was also in this sample reporting quite a lot of references to audio only, which is interesting, if not slightly irritating. I think some of it is comes out of the pandemic need to create something quickly. Otherwise, it would sort of surprise me to say that we are actually going back from video to telephone interpreting. And the interpreters, they did this weekly, and they work with different on average 4 different types of configurations of all the ones that we were asking them about. So you can see there is now even a lot more variety, and the older research, I think, can still come in handy here to see what also what we need to follow up on, what we need to ask. Yeah, I will move forward because I won't go to the recent hearing, because I want to show you some to summarize this whole area about practices, experiences, perceptions. As I said, there are many further studies that I have no time here to go through, but as a bit of an overview, these studies in conference interpreting, we see some very new ones now, relatively new ones now. In legal, we have even more than I have mentioned. In healthcare, health or social care, we also have a number of studies that have looked at experiences. I have already mentioned that to some extent beforehand. We've summarized some of that in a handbook, the handbook by Laura Gavioli and Cecilia Wartensjö, that will come out soon. So if you want to also have an overview there, you can have a look. The common findings there are, I mean, we have to be careful here. Some of these studies have really been done from an interpreting scholar's perspective, and other studies in this, especially in the healthcare setting, have been done by healthcare scholars that that had other priorities, as I have already mentioned before. They had, for example, they focused much more on patient satisfaction. They didn't necessarily always interview, so to say, or survey even the interpreters, but the general outcome is a little bit difficult to generalize this so much here, but in principle, some of the general outcomes are that, yes, there is higher satisfaction and preferences for on-site interpreting, and that video is more highly rated than telephone interpreting. But there's also there is an acknowledgement of the benefits of distance interpreting, but we can also clearly see from those studies that sort of the satisfaction and the preferences are associated with specific factors. There is a very interesting study by Price and colleagues showing that these distance modalities are okay for the simpler kinds of conversation, like appointment making, but whenever it comes to assessment of health conditions or anything that is more complex, then even doctors wish that there is on-site interpreting, and of course the interpreters wish that there's on-site interpreting. As far as the patient experiences and preferences are concerned, there I must say I find that sometimes these studies are perhaps not entirely satisfactory, so to speak, because some of these were randomized trials or similar constructs where the interpreters were only exposed to one of the various modalities that were compared. And I think we all know that sort of the prevailing difficulties in accessing healthcare interpreters, the patient's comparable levels of satisfaction with each of these modalities may simply sort of stem from the comfort that they have derived from simply being able to access an interpreter. So they may not be very choosy, and therefore what they have indicated as preference, saying they like any of them, may not actually tell us a lot about the suitability of that particular distance modality. It may be more that the patients are just grateful to have any form of interpreter. So we need to perhaps be more nuanced in those studies to find out what's really going on there through the lens of a patient also. To move on, we have also something that I don't think I can cover here in full, but we have this large area of interpreting quality and performance-related factors. We did studies on this, others did study on this. We started, in fact, with this in our earlier Avidicus projects to survey interpreters and finding out their self-ratings for their own video interpret. In this case, it was again video interpreting, their self sort of perceived performance, which puzzled us a little bit, because in principle, the interpreters in our sample felt that comprehension is worse, or at least was worse at the time. Rapport with the other participants was also not as good as on-site, but the sort of target text production seemed to be okay. So that's quite puzzling how you do that if you don't really understand very well. Do you then use higher cognitive efforts, or what happens to your cognitive load? We didn't investigate that, but that's of course another big question coming out of that. We did, I think this might be known because I've published that, of course. We did an experimental study on specifically on video remote interpreting, consecutive mode in legal settings at the time, compare a small sample, but within subject study comparing different sessions, so on site, and then we did video, and then we replicated this experiment later to see whether the video condition, the video with training, and the video with training and better technology had any effect on that. We did find differences, some of them significant, although it's very small sample size, so it's a bit difficult to say. But we also found really interesting qualitative comments on what they thought affects the performance. Interestingly, some interpreters, in fact, sort of thought the performance is not affected, but then when you look at the comments very carefully, you can of course detect that there are issues. For example, the third interpreter here says the only thing that can go wrong with the video, so meaning with the video link, is the sound, and then because you don't hear very well, and so on and so forth. So, and of course we know that sound quality in these systems can go wrong, and certainly at that time it did go wrong. So yes, there are issues ultimately, and also the opinion that it's much more tiring. We didn't measure fatigue, but we can see that the interpreters all mentioned that it was more tiring. And we see in some of our data that that's difficult to explain in a short space of time. So don't worry too much about diagram, but basically we saw in our data that indicators for fatigue, such as hesitation, false starts, all of those, they grew over time in the remote condition compared to the on-site or traditional interpreting condition. So from that, we can indirectly conclude that there may be an earlier onset of fatigue, which is also what the study from Barbara Moser-Mercer, for example, showed. That was one of the perhaps major findings, that there seemed to be an earlier onset of fatigue in remote conference interpreting, so remote simultaneous interpreting. Again, I don't think we have enough time to delve deeper in this study, but it's of course very important to delve deeper, even though those studies are also now older. So there is the one by Barbara Moser-Mercer from the conference setting, and there is the one from the European Parliament that Bosino and Schlesinger reported later on. I've tried to compare them a bit in terms of their findings. There are discrepancies in those findings across the two studies. And even more importantly, there are discrepancies between the more subjective factors and the more objective factors. I'm always trying to use those with a little, I mean, how objective is objective, you all know that. But that has also puzzled the interpreting world, I think, for quite some time, that that there are these discrepancies that we still need to try and explain, or we need to try and replicate these studies to delve deeper into them and see what reasons we can find for such different results. It's of course not too surprising, because we have small numbers of studies here. We have relatively small numbers of participants. And you can also see that there is variation between these outcomes from the conference setting in remote interpreting and the outcomes from the study that we did in our video course, where we found rather stark differences. Of course, legal interpreters are trained differently and often not as well trained as conference interpreters, so we could have some differences there. We also have to move on, we also have more recent studies. We have in legal interpreting, we have a much more recent study from Sandra Hale and colleagues in 2022, reported in the Interpreting Journal, of course, that showed a three-way comparison between on-site face-to-face and on-site telephone and video interpreting in legal settings, where video interpreting came out as being closer to face-to-face interpreting as opposed to telephone interpreting. So again, a different result. But as I say, we don't have a large number of studies, so I think this still needs much more research to see where we really are with the quality of distance interpreting across these different settings. We have We have some interesting studies also in healthcare looking at interpreting quality, not quantitatively, but some do qualitatively. So ASTER study, of course. Then we have some, again, from the sort of healthcare perspective, mostly self-reported, but some of them, in fact, Antilla, for example, Antilla and colleagues, or Lyon and colleagues, they have found some indirect methods looking at comprehension. How much did the patients or the carers of the patients understand? And it came out that in face-to-face and video interpreting, there seemed to be a better understanding. So they tested the comprehension basically than in the telephone interpreting condition. So that's yet another interesting approach to try and research, interpret, to some extent, interpreting quality. Of course, understanding can be affected by a lot of other things than the interpreting quality, but I think it's also a way of collecting data when it might be difficult to record and to transcribe data, as we find in some healthcare settings is difficult. In legal settings is very difficult in many countries to record and then transcribe and analyze actual interpreting performance. So we have to work with other methods here. That might explain this. So I think I'm nearly running out of time. I want to quickly mention a couple of things in the interactional space. Actually, to say that, of course, the this has also been researched across the different settings, where mostly in legal and in healthcare, obviously, but I will summarize this. We have some very interesting detailed studies, microanalytical studies here, that show us that subtle differences in the interaction, for example, when people are not co-located, when the interpreter is not co-located with the other language speaker in this particular case, can lead to changes in the interactional sequences, can lead to changes in the perception of an anticipation that is possible of what the participants want to do next. So Christian Licop, our Aridicus colleague, who has also published many more studies in this, has reported this interesting case where an asylum seeker was in immigration hearings. The asylum seeker was remote and was trying to tell, present his case and his story, and the interpreter was chunking this in order to interpret it consecutively in court. So the interpreter was in court, and the interpreter and nobody in courtroom noticed that the story hadn't actually ended, but because of the chunking and the interpretation, somebody else took the floor in the courtroom, and the conversation went a different, or the communication went a different way. So you see that has changed the sort of sequential order of this, and that's, of course, sounds like a small change, but that can, of course, have a drastic effect when so much is at stake as it is when you have asylum seekers in court. Similarly, I jump over my own example. Very interesting study from Klammer and Pöchacker recently in the healthcare setting, which it's different, but it goes in the same direction here, to say that in this case, this was video remote interpreting. So the interpreter was remote and the patient and the doctor were co-located, and where we see that this kind of spatial arrangement led to problems. The doctor had to sort of switch between looking at the screen to the interpreter and looking away from the screen to the patient, and found that apparently quite stressful and difficult. And ultimately here it was the doctor, and that's also a good sign, the doctor here developed some strategies of getting to grips with that. He was sort of chunking this, the turns for the interpreter, so that he had more control over it, which was ultimately, I think, from my understanding of reading the study, a good thing in this case, that this allowed a more managed way of doing the turn taking, and ultimately meant that the information got across. So this is also an interesting example of, I would say, adaptation, to put it bluntly. In this case, adaptation on the part of the people who need the interpretation here, on the part of the doctor. Of course, we also see adaptation on the part of the interpreter sometimes. yeah, I meant to talk a bit more about adaptation, but I know it's a bit late now. We can certainly, maybe you believe me on this one, we can certainly see from our experimental studies that where we replicated experiments after 2 years with the same interpreters after they had more training and so on, we can see how and more exposure also, of course, we can see how they have adapted their strategies, especially, of course, the interaction strategies. And but if we can at least use exposure and more training to enable interpreters to adapt interactional strategies, okay, mostly for these public service settings here, but then I think some other issues will also go away, because in our data we can also see that interactional issues, or like turn-taking issues and overlap, lead to loss of information when people talk over each other. So if we fix the interaction a little bit, then maybe other things will also become smoother. So, and with this, yes, many more studies on interaction, they are coming out now. And what is very interesting there is, as my last point before I come to my conclusion, there's more studies on interaction in video mediated than there was in the more recent past, where we have, of course, we also have interesting studies, by the way, on telephone interpreting. I haven't talked about that so much. I don't want to sideline them, but they remain an important form, especially in healthcare, I think. And but the studies who looked at the video mediated interaction in, for example, in healthcare settings or some other public service settings, and those studies who have presented these detailed micro-analytical accounts that I've just shown you, they have actually also been able to portray video-mediated interpreting as something which is, again, of greater visual complexity, perhaps, than even an on-site scenario, because we are surrounded by multiple screens. We are working with multiple devices, as I pointed out before. So from the point of view of visual or multimodal complexity, these scenarios are more demanding potentially. And these studies, I think, have clearly shown us that through this detailed analysis of the interaction, that perhaps we need to question a little bit the other accounts that we see from the surveys that I mentioned earlier. So in the healthcare interpreting world, or healthcare management world, we have these many surveys about preferences between on-site telephone and video interpreting, where often the order is indeed on-site is the best and video is there in the middle. And perhaps we have to call them into question a little bit in the face of this complexity that we see, how people, interpreters and participants, find it quite challenging to get to grips with that multimodal interaction. So that's, again, more discrepancies, unfortunately. We also need to look at other factors, of course, that are at play. So adaptation could be at play, but then also what's, as I said before, what happens with the interpreters and their cognitive effort, what happens with the system design. So there are a lot of other factors that we always have to keep in play, which brings me to my summary. Key challenges, I don't think I want to go to all of them again at a glance. It goes back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, that the technology here is an added dimension, that we have many known interpreting challenges, and that in several cases where we have seen, of course, research always puts a critical perspective on. I'm not trying to portray this here that to say distance interpreting isn't possible, but of course it's our task as researchers also to identify the issues. And I think in our research we do see there are problems in the linguistic, communicative, interactional and cognitive and all other dimensions. There are challenges out of the adding in the technology. It requires adaptation. It raises new questions about system and interface design. Of course, some configurations can also provide flexibility, protected work environments for an interpreter. So there's a balance here between benefits and challenges, between different kinds of affordances. Awareness is important. There's a lot of focus now on remote simultaneous interpreting at the moment. I feel that in the other fields of interpreting, these challenges that come from distance interpreting are not always as well recognized, even though, and at the same time, the challenges and what is at stake there for people is equally high, if not higher. We need to be careful in those settings, in public sector settings, where there is also not a lot of funding for these things, often that this drive towards using technology as a solution doesn't, and all the digital reform drives that are not necessarily sufficiently focused on linguistic minorities, on multilingualism, on bringing in interpreters, that these trends ultimately don't lead to a digital exclusion of certain groups of society rather than being in any way helpful. So that I think is particularly important in public service settings. And some of the questions for future research are, I have quickly outlined here. I think we have a relatively good understanding, or we have begun to understand, as you like it, the impact of distance interpreting on quality and all the related psychological and physiological factors on interaction, user experience, what have you. But of course, we need a lot of consolidation on that across all these different emerging settings. And I think we need much more future work also on the broader issues, long-term impact of working conditions on things like well-being. This is, by the way, something that has already been tackled a lot more in the world of sign language interpreting and video interpreting. In the volume that I published with Jamina and Robert Skinner, we have a good selection also of both of spoken language and sign language interpreting with technology, where in the sign language contributions, I think there's already a lot more emphasis on that. There's also the work by Hildegard Hauerland, for example, and others who work in video-mediated sign language interpreting that have already put much more focus on these broader working conditions. There are also others. It's unfortunately impossible to mention everyone here. So, but then apart from that, we also need to look at mitigating factors, to summarize that, and the potentially mitigating factors and their impact on distance interpreting. So optimized system or interface design, supporting technologies, personal predisposition, training, skills development. So all of these factors, they could play in favor of using distance interpreting, or could optimize this entire scenario. And I think because this was also meant really to be on the research side here, I think we need to invest, so to say, effort in more methodological development. I think this is on a really good way, but we need to find good ways of capturing and or measuring the different factors in different configurations. I think we need to find ways of combining these the results from these experimental studies that we see with qualitative methods, simply because so much is unknown there that I think sometimes qualitative research in the first place can give us richer insights and helps us to really define the variables that we need to look at. And I do think we need a lot more participatory approaches to optimizing distance interpreting, involving all the stakeholders, us as researchers, but also the people who are actually trying to work with this. Sorry, I've overrun my talk. I thought I didn't have enough to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Sabine. I mean, for such a rich account of on the topic of distance interpreting. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any questions, but I do want to let the audience know, online and on-site, that Professor Braun will be moderating one of the sessions in which 2 or 3 presentations are from her group. So if you have questions for her, you can certainly take that opportunity to ask her the questions. And because we do need to use this very, very short break to allow the presenters from the next session, to test sharing their slides. So, but thank you so much again, Professor Braun. And we will be seeing you in the session you chair.